They stole my land. So I sold their $10 million mansions. Ethan Wallace inherited 1,500 acres of pristine land from his grandfather. The land included forests, lakes, and rolling meadows, untouched for generations. One morning, he received shocking news. The HOA had illegally sold his property to a developer while he was away on business. Furious and helpless, Ethan realized the system had failed him. The developer's plan? A luxury lakefront community, complete with $10 million mansions for the elite. Ethan vowed revenge, but legally. He began researching property loopholes, corporate law, and historical land claims. Ethan spent sleepless nights digging through county archives and legal records. He discovered that the HOA had no right to sell any property without the original owner's consent. Additionally, the lakefront properties were built on disputed land easements. Armed with this knowledge, Ethan realized he could turn the tables using the very law the HOA ignored. Every notice, anything they've sent, we're going to make sure that the HOA realizes they can't play games with you or your property. Not anymore. Meeting Victoria in person was a revelation. Her office was a modest space in a bustling part of town, but every shelf was stacked with legal texts, case files, and framed letters of recognition for her work. On the wall behind her desk hung a photograph of a courtroom scene, the caption reading, "Justice is the final verdict, not the one you're told to accept." Her eyes were sharp, and she had an uncanny ability to size people up within seconds, a skill Ethan found both unnerving and reassuring. They spent hours poring over every HOA notice, every bill, every complaint filed against him. Victoria explained the legal landscape in meticulous detail. "They've overstepped," she said, pointing to a section of the HOA bylaws, "and not just once. These liens and transactions are technically illegal. They violated multiple statutes regarding property rights and homeowner association conduct. We have grounds not only to challenge them, but to freeze their operations temporarily while the matter is under review." Ethan felt a rush of vindication. For months, he had felt powerless, trapped by the HOA's seemingly endless bureaucracy. Now, with Victoria at his side, he was finally reclaiming agency over his own life. Victoria was methodical in her approach. She filed an injunction that immediately froze all transactions and liens the HOA had placed against Ethan's property. Within days, the community buzzed with news. Ethan Wallace was no longer the passive, frustrated landowner. He had become a legal adversary with formidable resources and strategy. HOA board members received notices that made it clear that their actions were under scrutiny, and the prospect of a costly legal battle loomed over them like a storm cloud. But the process was not just legal, it was psychological. Victoria insisted that Ethan maintain meticulous records of every interaction with the HOA. Emails, letters, phone calls, even casual conversations at community events, they could all be crucial evidence. Ethan became hyper-aware of his surroundings, noting every irregularity, every overreach. Victoria taught him how to ask questions that elicited admissions, how to respond without giving away strategic advantage, and how to present himself in a way that emphasized both authority and composure. The neighborhood began to notice the shift. Casual remarks at the local grocery store turned into hushed discussions at HOA meetings. Rumors spread about Ethan's mysterious lawyer and her reputation for dismantling corrupt associations. For the first time, Ethan saw hesitation in Karen's posture, uncertainty in her words. She was no longer operating with impunity. Each interaction was now a delicate dance of power dynamics, one that Victoria choreographed expertly behind the scenes. Victoria's legal maneuvering also had a public relations component. She contacted a local investigative journalist who had previously reported on HOA corruption and mismanagement. The journalist visited Ethan's property, spoke with him about the bridge, the repeated violations, and the community's complicity. Within a week, a feature article appeared in the local newspaper titled "Homeowner Takes on HOA in Landmark Property Dispute." The piece painted Ethan not as a troublemaker, but as a principled landowner standing up for his rights. The HOA's image suffered immediately, with members receiving pointed calls from concerned neighbors, investors, and community activists questioning the legality of their actions. Victoria's strategy was unrelenting. She filed additional motions challenging the validity of the HOA's special assessments, demanded an independent audit of their finances, and prepared a detailed case highlighting conflicts of interest among the board members. Each filing was precise, supported by documentation and legal precedent, leaving the HOA scrambling to respond. Ethan, meanwhile, began to understand the complexities of the legal system in ways he had never imagined. He realized that fighting back wasn't just about anger or retribution. It was about planning, patience, and precision. Victoria taught him that the smallest oversight could undo weeks of progress, while the most meticulous documentation could become his strongest weapon. The transformation in him was profound. He went from feeling like a victim to becoming a proactive strategist, anticipating the HOA's next moves and preparing responses in consultation with Victoria. Despite the growing tension, there were moments of camaraderie and strategy sessions that reminded Ethan of why he had pursued this fight. Victoria, though demanding, had a dry sense of humor and often broke the tension with a sarcastic comment or wry observation about HOA absurdities. It's amazing how people get elected to committees and suddenly believe they're royalty, she remarked one afternoon, reviewing evidence of a board member's unauthorized use of community funds. Ethan laughed for the first time in weeks, feeling the weight of months of stress begin to lift. The chapter's climax came when Victoria scheduled a preliminary injunction hearing. Ethan sat in the courtroom, watching as Karen and several HOA board members fidgeted in their seats, papers clutched tightly, faces pale with anxiety. Victoria's arguments were razor-sharp, citing statute after statute, pointing out procedural errors, and emphasizing the overreach that the HOA had committed. The judge listened attentively, asking pointed questions that left the HOA scrambling to respond. By the end of the hearing, a temporary injunction was granted. All pending transactions and liens were frozen, giving Ethan breathing room and, more importantly, sending a clear message. He was not to be underestimated. Leaving the courthouse, Ethan felt a surge of pride and relief. He turned to Victoria, who simply said, "This is just the beginning. They'll regroup, they'll strategize, but so will we. Stay ready." As news of the legal victory spread, Ethan received messages from neighbors expressing support, some timidly, others boldly congratulating him. It was a turning point, not just in the legal battle, but in the psychological war that had been raging for years. For the first time, the scales of power were tipping in his favor. By the end of the chapter, Ethan was no longer just a frustrated rancher fighting for a bridge. He had become a symbol of resistance, a man who refused to let corrupt authority dictate the terms of his life. With Victoria Chun at his side, he knew that the fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt truly equipped to win. The stage was set for the next phase of the battle, one that would test courage, strategy, and the resolve of everyone involved. Ethan looked over his property as he drove back home, the lake shimmering in the afternoon sun. Every ripple in the water, every shadow across the field seemed to whisper one simple truth. He was no longer alone, and he was no longer powerless. Victoria Chin spent countless hours combing through the HOA's financial records, contracts, and corporate filings, her sharp eyes catching discrepancies that even seasoned auditors had overlooked. The deeper she dug, the clearer the pattern became. Many of the sprawling lakefront mansions, once symbols of the HOA board's untouchable wealth, had been financed through a web of shell companies tied to the association itself. Some of these entities were set up offshore. Others were opaque trusts that concealed the true owners and skirted regulations. The legality of the entire operation was questionable at best, fraudulent at worst. When she presented the findings to Ethan, his eyes widened. "You're saying, I can take these houses?" he asked, a mix of disbelief and exhilaration in his voice. Victoria nodded. "Not just take them," she said. "We can file foreclosure claims. These properties are vulnerable because the HOA violated multiple lending laws and misrepresented ownership. Each mansion is leverage, real, tangible leverage. The plan was meticulous. Victoria drafted the legal documents with surgical precision, ensuring that every claim was airtight, leaving the HOA no room for escape. Notices were sent to each shell company, each mansion now under threat of foreclosure due to the illegal financing schemes. Overnight, the balance of power shifted. The same HOA members who had mocked Ethan for his pointless fight now found themselves scrambling, their authority undermined, their assets at risk. Word spread through the community like wildfire. Rumors of legal claims, frozen transactions, and looming foreclosures rattled the once complacent neighbors. Panic replaced arrogance. Meetings were hastily called, and board members whispered in corridors, trying desperately to assess the storm they had unwittingly invited into their lives. Ethan, for the first time in years, felt a heady sense of control. What had begun as a fight to reclaim his bridge and protect his property had transformed into a carefully orchestrated counterattack, a legal chess game in which he held all the pieces, and the HOA was already on the defensive. By the end of the week, the reality had sunk in. The $10 million mansions were no longer untouchable symbols of HOA power. They were now pawns in Ethan's strategic revenge, and he intended to play the game to its very last move. The courthouse was packed that morning. The smell of polished wood, ink-stained documents, and faint coffee filled the air as Ethan Wallace sat beside Victoria Chun, feeling a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and quiet determination. Months of research, documentation, and preparation had led to this moment. For the first time in the long, exhausting battle against the HOA, victory was within reach. Victoria had been meticulous in her work. She had traced the ownership of one of the largest lakefront mansions, an imposing structure perched at the edge of a private cove, through layers of shell companies, trusts, and questionable mortgage arrangements. The documentation was airtight. The HOA's own financing schemes had left the property vulnerable. Ethan had never imagined that such a behemoth could fall under his legal influence. Yet here they were, poised to make history. As the judge called the case, Ethan's pulse quickened. Karen, sitting among the remaining HOA board members, looked calm at first, but Ethan could sense the tension radiating from her. This was their first real encounter with accountability, and her composure was a fragile mask over the fear that had been slowly creeping into her and her allies. Victoria presented the evidence with precision, walking the court through the tangled web of shell companies, the misrepresented ownership, and the illegal liens. Ethan watched as the board's attorney fumbled, trying to justify the indefensible. Questions were asked, objections raised, but Victoria's responses were swift, confident, and backed by law and irrefutable documentation. The courtroom seemed to shrink around Ethan as tension thickened the air, and the judge, an experienced figure with little patience for legal gamesmanship, listened intently. When the gavel finally fell, Ethan felt a surge of triumph he had not experienced in years. The judge ruled in his favor, awarding him control of the first lakefront mansion. For a moment, Ethan simply sat there, letting the reality wash over him. This was no longer theoretical. This was real. The first domino had fallen. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Local news crews, bloggers, and curious neighbors had all caught wind of the case. Cameras flashed as Ethan and Victoria walked to the parking lot, answering questions in measured tones. The story was irresistible. A determined property owner, long mocked and harassed by an overreaching HOA, had successfully taken control of one of the most luxurious mansions in the area. Headlines began to circulate within hours. Local homeowner wins landmark case against HOA. Property avenger strikes again, and HOA corruption exposed. First mansion falls. Ethan decided immediately that the mansion would not be hoarded or used purely for personal gain. Instead, he conceived a plan that would both fund his ongoing campaign against the HOA and make a public statement about justice and integrity. He would auction the mansion legally. A portion of the proceeds would go to charity, supporting underfunded community programs and land preservation initiatives, an action that would further cement his image as a principled defender of the public good. The remainder would fund the legal campaign to reclaim his land and continue challenging the HOA's overreach. The auction was meticulously planned. Ethan, guided by Victoria, contacted reputable auction houses, ensuring transparency at every step. Invitations were sent to potential bidders, journalists, and community leaders. The mansion, with its sprawling gardens, private docks, and panoramic views of a lake, became the centerpiece of media coverage. Drones flew overhead, capturing sweeping shots of the property for news segments, while reporters penned articles highlighting Ethan's rise as a symbol of justice. On the day of the auction, a crowd gathered outside the mansion. Cameras and microphones jostled for position, capturing every moment of the event. Ethan stood at the podium, flanked by Victoria and a small team of legal and media advisors. He spoke briefly but eloquently, emphasizing that the auction was a statement against corruption and a demonstration that justice could prevail even in a system stacked with privilege. The crowd, journalists, and online viewers absorbed every word. The bidding began, and soon the mansion's value, already impressive, skyrocketed as competitive offers poured in. Ethan's plan worked precisely as intended. The property fetched a sum far beyond what anyone expected. When the hammer finally fell, a portion of the proceeds was earmarked for local charities, and the rest was secured in trust for the ongoing legal campaign. Ethan could feel the energy around him. People cheered, journalists scribbled notes furiously, and social media lit up with hashtags celebrating his victory. For the HOA, the implications were immediate and terrifying. Karen and the remaining board members were blindsided, unsure how to respond. The property that they had assumed was untouchable, a symbol of their influence and wealth, had been legally wrested from their control. Overnight, Ethan Wallace was no longer the passive, harassed landowner. He had become a force, a man capable of turning the tools of the HOA against them. The nickname Property Avenger began to stick. Social media feeds, local news outlets, and even neighboring communities discussed Ethan's audacious victory. Whispers about the HOA's corruption spread like wildfire, sparking debates, interviews, and editorials that questioned the legality of other properties under their influence. Ethan realized that the first mansion was more than just a financial win. It was a psychological victory, a public demonstration that power and arrogance could be challenged, and that meticulous strategy could topple even the most entrenched authority. In the quiet moments after the auction, Ethan returned to his own property, looking out across the lake that had long been a symbol of frustration, conflict, and exclusion. The sun glinted off the water, casting shimmering reflections that seemed to celebrate the victory. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a sense of peace mixed with exhilaration. The battle was far from over, but the first step had been taken, and the path forward, though challenging, was finally illuminated. As he watched the last bidders leave and the media crews pack up their equipment, Ethan smiled, feeling the weight of the past few years begin to lift. He had taken the first mansion, but more importantly, he had reclaimed his confidence, his agency, and the moral high ground. And with Victoria Chun guiding the legal strategy, there was no limit to what he could achieve. The stage was set for the next phase of the campaign, dismantling the HOA's influence property by property and exposing the corruption that had festered unchecked for years. For Ethan Wallace, the first mansion was not just a house. It was the beginning of a revolution. Ethan Wallace had expected resistance, but he hadn't fully anticipated the sheer audacity of the HOA's retaliation. After losing control of the first lakefront mansion, Karen and her allies were desperate. Their veneer of civility was gone, replaced by an aggressive, almost reckless determination to reclaim control and intimidate Ethan into submission. What had been a subtle campaign of harassment and bureaucratic obstruction escalated into a full-blown offensive. It began quietly. Ethan noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Delivery trucks arrived at odd hours. Maintenance crews lingered unnecessarily around his property, and a few tenants reported suspicious visits from HOA representatives, sometimes accompanied by stern warnings or veiled threats. At first, he considered the possibility of coincidence, But Victoria Chun was adamant. The HOA was mobilizing against him. "Expect anything," she said over the phone during a late-night strategy session. "They've already shown they have no regard for law or ethics. When people feel cornered, they get dangerous." True to her prediction, the HOA escalated. Rumors spread about bribed officials, manipulated property records, and secret deals with local authorities. Karen attempted to meet with city clerks and legal aides, offering incentives to delay or invalidate Ethan's claims. He received anonymous calls warning him of consequences if he continued his campaign. Flyers appeared on cars around the neighborhood, warning residents about unverified claims on their properties, an obvious attempt to sow confusion and fear. But Ethan was prepared. Long before the HOA had completed their first covert action, he had anticipated the possibility of retaliation. Security cameras had been installed strategically around his property, capturing every approach, every unusual interaction. Digital logs of emails, letters, and phone calls were meticulously saved. Witnesses had been briefed and instructed to document incidents carefully. Contracts and legal agreements were cross-checked and fortified, leaving no room for loopholes or technicalities. When the first attempt to manipulate a property record occurred, it backfired spectacularly. Karen had tried to use a forged HOA resolution to invalidate Ethan's ownership claim on one of the smaller lakefront properties. But Victoria had foreseen the possibility. She had already filed copies of all legitimate HOA documents with the court and city offices. When the forged document was submitted, it was immediately flagged and investigated. The attempt to undermine Ethan became public record, further highlighting the HOA's corruption and adding to the mounting evidence of their illegal activity. Ethan watched the events unfold with a mix of satisfaction and grim determination. Each of the HOA's attacks, whether bribery attempts, intimidation, or administrative sabotage, served only to strengthen his case. Victoria skillfully used these missteps to his advantage, submitting them as evidence of a pattern of fraud and misconduct. By the time the media caught wind of the story, Ethan was no longer just a homeowner fighting back. He was a symbol of accountability and justice, a man willing to stand up to entrenched power with courage and precision. One particularly audacious attempt involved tenants who rented properties from Ethan under legitimate agreements. The HOA sent representatives to intimidate these tenants, trying to coerce them into breaking leases or refusing to cooperate with Ethan's legal strategy. Victoria responded quickly, instructing Ethan to have legal observers present during interactions with tenants, ensuring that every threat or attempt at coercion was documented. When the HOA's actions were exposed, the tenants publicly spoke out, corroborating Ethan's claims and adding further credibility to his campaign. The media began to notice the pattern. Local news stations ran stories detailing how the HOA's efforts to obstruct Ethan were failing spectacularly, with video footage and witness testimony highlighting their increasingly desperate and illegal maneuvers. Social media amplified the story, with hashtags like #PropertyAvenger, #HOA corruption, and #JusticeForEthan trending regionally. Even neighbors who had initially been skeptical began to reconsider their loyalties, some openly questioning the legitimacy of the HOA's past actions. Ethan, guided by Victoria, took a calculated approach to each new attack. He refused to react emotionally, understanding that rage or panic could create openings for the HOA's manipulations. Instead, he remained calm, methodical, and highly strategic. Each move he made was designed to anticipate the HOA's response, and each countermeasure reinforced his legal and public position. By the end of the month, the HOA's efforts had not only failed but had exposed their network of corruption more thoroughly than Ethan could have done through the courts alone. Bribery attempts, forged documents, and intimidation tactics were now part of a growing dossier that Victoria prepared for public release, should the court allow it. Each failure weakened Karen's influence, eroded the board's credibility, and strengthened Ethan's position both legally and socially. Ethan began to realize that the fight had evolved into more than just reclaiming property. It was a battle for justice, accountability, and reputation. The HOA's aggressive tactics, intended to suppress him, instead amplified his image as a principled, strategic, and relentless advocate for fairness. The nickname Property Avenger gained further traction, and the public began to view Ethan not only as a property owner, but as a defender of the community against entrenched corruption. The final blow in this phase came when a major bribery attempt was caught on camera. Karen had tried to pressure a city official with a personal incentive to block one of Ethan's foreclosure claims. The footage, captured by Ethan's hidden cameras and corroborated by Victoria's witnesses, made its way to the local news. The report was damning. City officials confirmed they were approached improperly, and the HOA faced immediate scrutiny, with investigations launched at both local and state levels. Ethan watched the broadcast from his lakefront property, the sun glinting off the water, and allowed himself a small smile. The HOA had tried to fight back, but each attempt had only strengthened his campaign. The narrative had shifted completely. He was no longer the victim. The HOA had become the antagonist, exposed for the first time in a way that could not be ignored. For Ethan, the lesson was clear. Preparation, foresight, and meticulous documentation could turn even the most desperate opposition into a tool for victory. As the day ended and the last news segments aired, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The counterattacks had failed, the HOA's corruption was exposed, and his momentum was unstoppable. The war for the lakefront, and for justice, was only intensifying, and Ethan was ready for every challenge ahead. Ethan Wallace had reached a turning point. The legal battles, the auctions, the HOA's increasingly desperate attacks, they had all built to this moment. With Victoria Chun at his side, he was ready to pull back the curtain on the corruption that had plagued his community for years. It was time not just to fight for his own property, but to expose the full scope of the HOA's illegal activities, to show the world the extent to which a small group of individuals had abused their power under the guise of neighborhood governance. The plan was meticulous. Victoria had spent weeks reviewing internal HOA documents, financial records, and communications, carefully assembling a dossier that left nothing to interpretation. Every fraudulent transaction, every illegal lien, every manipulated deed was documented, cross-referenced, and verified. The goal was not only legal victory, but undeniable public exposure. Ethan and Victoria understood that once the information went public, it would be impossible for the HOA to spin or contain the story. Ethan personally reviewed the documents one last time before they were released. He could feel the weight of history in his hands, proof of wrongdoing that, if revealed, would shake the community to its core. It was not a decision he took lightly. This was not simply about revenge. It was about justice, transparency, and accountability. Every spreadsheet, every scanned document, every internal email told a story of abuse of power and corruption. When a leak occurred, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets and social media channels erupted with coverage. Local TV stations ran multiple segments detailing the HOA's illegal sale of Ethan's land, highlighting the forged transactions, hidden shell companies, and unauthorized approvals that had enabled the theft. Newspapers printed exposés with headlines like HOA Scandal, Illegal Land Sales Exposed, and Local Homeowner Fights Back Against Corrupt Neighborhood Board. Social media amplified the story to an even greater scale. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Ethan, hashtag HOA Corruption, and hashtag Property Avenger began trending regionally within hours. Videos summarizing the legal battles, showcasing the documents, and featuring Ethan's measured commentary circulated across platforms, gaining hundreds of thousands of views. Comment sections filled with outraged citizens, neighbors, and even legal experts weighing in on the injustice. People expressed empathy, admiration, and outrage simultaneously. Ethan became a symbol, not just of one man's fight, but of resistance against entrenched, corrupt authority. Meanwhile, the lakefront mansion auctions, once simply a legal and financial strategy, became public spectacles. Investors, media personalities, and even curious neighbors attended in droves, eager to witness the unfolding drama firsthand. Drone footage captured the sweeping estates, crowds, and the bustling auction rooms, which were broadcast online and went viral. Each auction reinforced the narrative. Ethan was not only reclaiming his property, but also redistributing wealth in a way that was public, transparent, and principled. The public exposure had immediate consequences for the HOA. Karen and her allies faced mounting scrutiny from both local authorities and residents. Board members were questioned in public meetings, legal investigations were initiated, and previous attempts to intimidate Ethan were laid bare for everyone to see. The more they tried to defend themselves, the more their corruption became visible. Every meeting, every press statement, every attempted spin was met with skepticism and growing outrage. Residents who had once quietly accepted the HOA's authority now demanded accountability, calling for resignations, audits, and transparency measures. Ethan's public image soared. He was no longer just a property owner defending his land. He had become a figurehead for integrity and justice. Interviews with national news outlets followed, portraying him as a homeowner who dared to challenge the powerful, who refused to be silenced, and who leveraged both legal strategy and public engagement to achieve fairness. Editorials hailed him as the property avenger, a modern-day crusader for accountability in neighborhoods across the country. Victoria Chun, ever strategic, advised Ethan on how to maintain the momentum. Each piece of evidence released was paired with context, explaining not only the HOA's wrongdoing, but also the broader implications for homeowners everywhere. Public pressure mounted, with officials promising investigations and regulatory bodies reviewing similar HOA practices statewide. The message was clear: corruption, even under the guise of community governance, would not go unchecked. As Ethan watched the media frenzy, he reflected on how far he had come. The quiet man who once faced harassment, intimidation, and illegal property seizures had transformed into a symbol of justice, strategy, and resilience. The HOA's attempts to undermine him had backfired spectacularly, each misstep contributing to the growing narrative of corruption and the vindication of Ethan's cause. By the end of the week, the impact was undeniable. Community forums were flooded with discussions about HOA reform. Local news had dedicated special segments to the story, and social media was awash with citizen outrage and support for Ethan. Investors who had previously hesitated now participated in the auctions eagerly, further increasing the visibility and success of the events. Each auction, each press release, each viral video reinforced the growing perception that Ethan was not only right, but unstoppable. The public exposure achieved more than legal victory. It reshaped the social and political landscape of the neighborhood. Karen and the HOA board members were no longer untouchable figures of authority. They were public adversaries whose corruption had been laid bare. Ethan, meanwhile, solidified his position not only as a defender of his land, but as a figure of moral and strategic power, capable of using both the law and the court of public opinion to achieve justice. Sitting on the dock of his reclaimed property, Ethan watched the sun glint off the lake and felt a sense of accomplishment unlike any he had known before. The documents had done more than prove wrongdoing. They had inspired a community, captured national attention, and signaled a new era of accountability. The fight was far from over, but Ethan now understood the power of public exposure. Corruption could be defeated, authority could be challenged, and one determined individual could reshape the rules of the game as headlines continue to circulate. Ethan smiled faintly, knowing that the lakefront mansions, the auctions, and the exposed documents were more than just steps in a personal vendetta. They were part of a larger battle for justice, visibility, and integrity. And in this battle, he was emerging not just victorious, but untouchable. The day of the final court hearing arrived, and Ethan Wallace felt a mix of anticipation, resolve, and a quiet fury that had been simmering for months. The courthouse was larger than he expected, its towering columns and polished floors casting an aura of authority over the proceedings. Reporters, cameras, and members of the public crowded the galleries, each eager to witness the climactic confrontation between one man and the powerful HOA that had dominated the lakefront for decades. Ethan adjusted his tie, glanced at Victoria Chun, and silently acknowledged the gravity of the moment. This was the culmination of years of strategy, documentation, and relentless persistence. The outcome of this trial would not just determine ownership and legality, it would determine justice itself. Karen and the remaining HOA board members entered, their once commanding presence diminished. The legal battles and public exposure had taken a visible toll. Their confident postures were replaced by anxious gestures, whispered consultations, and occasional glances of disbelief. It was clear to everyone present that the tide had turned. Once untouchable figures, they were now on the defensive, exposed both legally and publicly. The air in the courtroom was tense, thick with the anticipation of a verdict that everyone knew would carry weight far beyond this one case. Victoria Chun began the proceedings with a meticulous presentation of the evidence. She laid out the full extent of the HOA's corruption, forged documents, illegal sales of Ethan's land, manipulated property records, and financial schemes designed to enrich the board at the expense of homeowners. Each piece of evidence was accompanied by detailed explanations, timelines, and witness testimonies. Ethan watched as the board members squirmed, unable to counter the precise, overwhelming case that Victoria had constructed. The turning point came when Victoria presented the financial audit of the HOA's transactions. Every illegal sale, every diverted dollar, and every improperly executed lien was itemized with irrefutable clarity. The judge scrutinized the documents carefully, asking pointed questions that left the HOA's attorney fumbling for explanations. Attempts to downplay or dismiss the evidence were futile. Victoria's preparation and foresight had anticipated every potential objection. Ethan, seated at the plaintiff's table, felt a wave of vindication as the courtroom absorbed the weight of the evidence. Months of careful planning, exhaustive research, and unwavering persistence had led to this moment. The audience murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering in admiration. Outside the courtroom, reporters relayed live updates to news outlets and social media, ensuring that the story reached a wider audience even before the verdict was announced. The board members of the HOA attempted one last desperate maneuver, a procedural objection intended to delay the ruling. But Victoria, anticipating such tactics, responded with calm authority. She referenced precedents, cited statutes, and demonstrated that every HOA attempt to obstruct justice was not only predictable but illegal. The judge, clearly impressed by her expertise and composure, denied the objection, reinforcing the courtroom's acknowledgement that the HOA's actions were both unethical and unlawful. As the final arguments concluded, Ethan felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. He had fought long and hard, endured harassment, threats, and legal manipulation, and now the culmination of his efforts was within reach. Victoria presented a closing statement that resonated beyond the immediate legal matters. She emphasized the principle that no organization, no matter how entrenched, was above accountability. Her words highlighted the broader implications of the case. A community had been exploited, authority had been abused, and justice demanded restitution. The judge retired briefly to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in hushed suspense. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, a steady rhythm that mirrored the passing minutes. Reporters whispered among themselves, documenting the tension for live coverage. Board members exchanged anxious glances, their previous confidence replaced by visible fear. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd of supporters and curious neighbors gathered, sensing that a historic moment was unfolding. When the judge returned, the air was electric with anticipation. Every eye in the courtroom focused on the bench as the ruling was delivered. The HOA must return all illegal profits obtained through fraudulent sales and liens. The board members were held personally accountable for their actions, facing both financial penalties and criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and abuse of authority. Ethan's land was fully reinstated, with his ownership legally recognized and protected from any future attempts at illegal seizure. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Karen and the board members looked stunned, their faces pale with disbelief. The humiliation was compounded by the financial ruin that awaited them. The misappropriated funds would be reclaimed and penalties imposed, leaving the corrupt leaders stripped of both power and wealth. Whispers of disbelief echoed through the courtroom, some sympathetic, most incredulous, as the implications of the ruling sank in. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with coverage, and hashtags like #JusticeForEthan, #HOA corruption, and #PropertyAvenger trended regionally and nationally. News anchors recounted the story in detail. A local homeowner had faced intimidation, harassment, and illegal seizure. Yet through meticulous planning, strategic legal action, and unwavering determination, he had exposed systemic corruption and reclaimed his property. Analysts praised Ethan's perseverance and Victoria's legal brilliance, emphasizing that the case was a landmark example of how accountability could prevail over entrenched power. Supporters gathered outside the courthouse to congratulate Ethan. Neighbors, investors, and curious onlookers surrounded him, many expressing admiration for his resilience and moral fortitude. Some shared personal stories of how the HOA had affected them, further amplifying the narrative of systemic corruption that Ethan had fought against. The sense of community solidarity was palpable. Ethan's victory was not only personal but communal, representing the triumph of justice and transparency over exploitation and deceit. The aftermath of the ruling rippled through the HOA. Karen and her allies were removed from their positions, their influence dismantled, and their credibility irreparably damaged. Investigations were launched into other properties and actions of the association, prompted by the evidence revealed during the trial. Residents who had previously tolerated or ignored the board's actions began to demand reforms, transparency measures, and accountability mechanisms to prevent future abuses. The landscape of the neighborhood was irrevocably changed. Ethan, standing on his fully restored property, reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The lake, once a symbol of frustration and conflict, now glimmered with the promise of peace and justice. He had endured intimidation, navigated complex legal battles, and faced down corruption, yet he had emerged victorious. Victoria Chun, standing beside him, offered a rare smile, acknowledging the culmination of their collaborative effort. Together, they had transformed a personal struggle into a landmark example of accountability and ethical action. As the sun set over the reclaimed lakefront, Ethan understood the full significance of the day. The HOA had been defeated not merely through force or aggression, but through meticulous planning, unwavering persistence, and the strategic use of law and public opinion. Justice had been served, and the corrupt leaders were humiliated, financially ruined, and exposed to the scrutiny of both their community and the broader public. Ethan's victory was complete, but it was more than a personal triumph. It was a statement. Corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched, could be challenged. Abuse of authority could be punished. And one determined individual, armed with strategy, evidence, and integrity, could turn the tide against seemingly insurmountable power. The showdown had ended, but its legacy would resonate for years to come, a testament to courage, foresight, and the relentless pursuit of justice. With the HOA defeated, the corrupt board dismantled, and his property fully reinstated, Ethan Wallace finally turned his attention to the future, a future defined not just by personal victory, but by the opportunity to transform his 1,500 acres into something lasting, meaningful, and beneficial to the community. For years, the land had been a battleground, a site of conflict, harassment, and legal struggles. Now, it could become a sanctuary, a symbol of stewardship, and a tangible expression of Ethan's principles. The first step was environmental restoration. Ethan hired a team of ecologists, landscape architects, and conservation specialists to assess the health of the land. They discovered that years of neglect, coupled with improper management by the previous owners and interference by the HOA, had left large portions of the property degraded. Erosion along the lake's edges, invasive plant species, and depleted soil quality threatened the natural ecosystem. It was a stark reminder that his fight had not only been for ownership, but for the survival and health of the land itself. Ethan committed to a long-term reforestation and conservation plan. Native trees were planted across the property, restoring habitats for birds, deer, and other wildlife. Wetlands along the lake were carefully revitalized to filter runoff and prevent pollution. Trails were created to allow visitors to experience the land without disrupting the delicate balance of flora and fauna. Over time, the 1,500 acres transformed from a neglected, contested space into a thriving ecosystem, where the natural beauty of the area could flourish free from corruption and exploitation. In addition to environmental restoration, Ethan envisioned a space that would benefit the community directly. He established a small community park near the lake, complete with walking paths, picnic areas, and a kayak launch for residents to enjoy the water responsibly. An educational center was built on the property, designed to teach visitors about local ecology, conservation, and responsible land stewardship. Schools from the surrounding region were invited for field trips, workshops, and interactive programs that emphasize sustainability and environmental responsibility. Ethan wanted future generations to understand the importance of protecting their natural surroundings, a lesson he had learned firsthand through his fight against the HOA. The profits from the $10 million mansion auctions were integral to this vision. Rather than keeping the wealth solely for personal gain, Ethan strategically allocated the funds to ensure long-term community impact. Scholarships were established for local students, particularly those pursuing environmental science, public administration, and community development. The scholarships provided full tuition, mentorship programs, and internship opportunities, creating pathways for talented young individuals who might otherwise have been overlooked. By investing in education, Ethan sought to empower future leaders who could continue advocating for justice, transparency, and sustainability. Local development projects also benefited from the mansion profits. Small business grants were distributed to residents looking to launch ventures that aligned with community values, such as ecotourism, organic farming, and educational programming. Infrastructure improvements were funded, including the restoration of nearby roads, the creation of accessible walking paths, and the installation of sustainable energy solutions such as solar panels and wind turbines. Ethan's goal was to create a thriving, self-sustaining community that could prosper without reliance on exploitative or corrupt authorities. The transformation of the land and the community had profound effects on Ethan personally. Walking through the restored forests, watching children learn about the lake ecosystem, and seeing the community engage with the land filled him with a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced before. The battles, the lawsuits, the auctions, and the public exposure had all led to this moment, a tangible legacy that combined justice, environmental stewardship, and social responsibility. Ethan also ensured that transparency and accountability remained central to the project. Advisory boards were created, including community representatives, ecologists, and educators, to oversee ongoing management of the land, park, and educational programs. Regular public reports detailed financial allocations, environmental improvements, and community engagement metrics. By creating these systems, Ethan prevented future misuse or mismanagement, ensuring that the restoration was both sustainable and protected from the kind of corruption he had fought against. Media coverage continued to highlight the transformation. Articles and news segments focused on how a homeowner, once the target of harassment and illegal land seizure, had turned his victory into a lasting benefit for the entire community. Headlines celebrated the restoration of the lakefront and the creation of educational opportunities, from conflict to conservation. Local hero restores 1,500 acres, and property avenger becomes community benefactor. The public perception of Ethan shifted further, from determined homeowner to visionary leader, demonstrating that justice and philanthropy could coexist in extraordinary ways. The lake itself, central to Ethan's vision, became a focal point for restoration efforts. He worked with marine biologists and water quality specialists to monitor and improve the health of the ecosystem. Fish populations rebounded, and aquatic plants returned to their natural abundance. Shoreline stabilization projects prevented erosion, and controlled reforestation along the banks created natural filtration systems. Local wildlife returned in increasing numbers, from songbirds nesting in newly planted trees to beavers rebuilding natural dams along smaller streams feeding the lake. Visitors marveled at the revived landscape, unaware of the intense struggle that had preceded this rebirth. Ethan also recognized the importance of storytelling in preserving the legacy of the land. He commissioned a documentary series detailing the transformation of the 1,500 acres, from the initial conflict with the HOA to the ongoing restoration and community projects. Interviews with Victoria Chan, ecologists, local leaders, and residents highlighted the collaborative nature of the effort, emphasizing that meaningful change often required strategy, persistence, and ethical vision. The documentary aired on Regional. Restored Wetland was a reminder of the persistence, foresight, and strategic planning that had been necessary to overcome corruption, intimidation, and adversity. He felt a profound sense of fulfillment, not only for the personal victory, but for the broader impact he had achieved, creating a model for justice, restoration, and community empowerment. The $10 million mansion profits, once symbols of conflict and contention, have been transformed into instruments of positive change. Scholarships allowed talented students to pursue higher education. Local development grants fostered economic growth. The community park and educational center provided learning, recreation, and environmental awareness. The lakefront, once a site of strife, became a shared space for enjoyment, education, and reflection. Every decision Ethan made was guided by the principle that his land should benefit more than just himself. It should serve the community, preserve the environment, and inspire future generations. By the end of the first year of restoration, the transformation was undeniable. The 1,500 acres had become a thriving ecosystem, a hub for community engagement, and a symbol of resilience and justice. Media outlets, community leaders, and visitors frequently highlighted the achievement, emphasizing how one individual's determination, combined with strategic legal action and thoughtful philanthropy, could create lasting positive change. Ethan Wallace, once embroiled in a battle for survival and property rights, had become a steward, a benefactor, and a visionary leader whose actions would be remembered long after the conflicts that had preceded them. Looking over the lake one evening, Ethan reflected on the journey. From the initial theft of his property to the battles in court, the auctions, the public exposure, and finally the restoration, every step had been hard-won. But the outcome, an ecosystem restored, a community empowered, and a legacy secured, made every challenge worthwhile. The land, the lake, and the people it now served stood as living proof that justice, determination, and responsible stewardship could create profound, lasting change. Ethan finally sat on his lakefront porch, reflecting on the battle. The HOA was powerless, his land secure, and justice had been served. He realized that true power came not from rage, but from knowledge, patience, and the law. His grandfather's legacy was safe, and Ethan's name became a legend in local lore, a warning to anyone who dared challenge rightful ownership.